Hi everyone, good morning. I feel like I need to to stand up a little bit to say hello and to see everyone. So welcome to this special book panel discussion of Culling the Masses, the Democratic Origins of Racist Immigration Policy in the Americas. This is an award-winning book written by David Scott Fitzgerald and David Cook Martin, published by Harvard University Press last year in 2 years ago in 2014 now. This book, which analyzed legal records from 22 countries between 1790 and 2010, demonstrates the relationship between democracy and racism in immigration law. It upends the conventional perception that democratic countries should have less discriminatory immigration laws than undemocratic ones. Fitzgerald and Cook-Martin remind us that in many cases, however, this was the opposite. The U.S., for example, led the way in legalizing discrimination in immigration and naturalization law, beginning in 1790, and Canada and many countries in Latin America followed. In contrast, in the 1930s and the 1940s, undemocratic regimes in Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Cuba ended their practice of discriminatory laws decades before the U.S. and Canada. In the case of the U.S. and North America, the authors argue it is World War II and the Cold War that ultimately lead to change in policy, one that is still mixed and contradictory. It's racial politics that is the crucial factor here. This book has been widely discussed, including a review issue of Ethnic and Racial Studies, and it has been widely praised. It's received the 2015 Best Book Award, Migration and Citizenship section of the American Political Science Association, the 2015 Thomas and Janeski Best Book Award, International Migration section of the American Sociological Association. It was co-winner of the 2015 Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship Award from the Political Sociology section of the American Sociological Association, and it received an honorable mention for the 2015 Theodore Saludos Memorial Book Award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. The timing for our discussion, of course, of this book and the subject of immigration law could not be better. In October this past year, we recognized the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act in the United States. And of course, xenophobia and immigration in the United States and around the world continue to be a hotly debated issue. What can a comparative, interdisciplinary, intersectional, multi-sided and longitudinal study like Culling the Masses tell us about this history and how we might continue to probe the past in order to understand the present? The panel of scholars joining us today could not be better suited for this task. So starting all the way at the end of the table is Donna Gabatia, Professor of History at the University of Toronto and past Director of the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota. She's the author of many books and articles on immigrant class, gender, and food studies in the United States, and also on Italian migration around the world and on migration in world history. Her most recent book, published just this past fall, is Gender and International Migration, co-authored with the sociologist Catherine Donato. Her book, Foreign Relations, won the 2012 Theodore Saludos Prize from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society, and she's the past president of the Social Science History Association. Next to Donna is Professor Madeline Hsu, Professor of History at University of Texas, Austin, and former director of the Center of Asian American Studies. She's the author of many books, including Dreaming of Gold, Dreaming of Home, Transnationalism and Migration Between the U.S. and South China, which won the 2002 Association for Asian American Studies Book Award. She also co-edited Chinese Americans and the Politics of Race and Culture with Su-Cheng Chan, and edited Him Mark Li's Chinese American Transnational Politics. Her most recent book is The Good Immigrants, How the Yellow Peril Became the Model Minority, and was published last year by Princeton. Next to me is Jose Moya, Professor of History and Director of the Forum on Migration at Barnard College, also Director of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University and Professor Emeritus from UCLA. He has authored more than 50 publications, including Cousins and Strangers, Spanish Immigrants in Buenos Aires, a book that received 5 awards for its contributions to migration and Latin American studies. And he's currently working on a book about anarchism in Buenos Aires during the Belle Epoque, and editing another book titled Atlantic Crossings, Webs of Migration, Culture, and Politics Between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, 1800 to 2010. Professor Jeffrey Lesser is also on the program for today, but unfortunately for us, but fortunately for him, he is in Brazil and not at the AHA, so he will not be joining us. However, we do have the two authors of Culling the Masses, David Cook Martin and David Scott Fitzgerald, also here at the table. David Cook Martin is Associate Professor of Sociology at Grinnell College and Director of its Center for International Studies. His work as a political sociologist focuses on understanding migration, race, ethnicity, law, and citizenship in an international field of power. In addition to being co-author of Culling the Masses, he is also the author of The Scramble for Citizens, Dual Nationality and State Competition for Immigrants from Stanford University Press. It won the Thomas Lindnetsky Best Book on International Migration in 2014. David has also published articles and chapters on transnational religious networks, ethnic return migration, integration, and Latin American migrations to Europe. David Scott Fitzgerald, in the middle, is Theodore Gildred Chair in U.S.-Mexican Relations, Professor of Sociology, and co-director of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at the University of California, San Diego. In addition to co-authoring Culling the Masses, he's also the author of A Nation of Immigrants, How Mexico Managed its Migration from UC Press, and co-editor of 6 books on Mexico-U.S. migration. His work on the politics of international migration, citizenship, and research methodology has been published in the American Journal of Sociology, International Migration Review, Comparative Studies in Society and History, Ethnic and Racial Studies, and numerous other journals. His current project examines asylum policies in comparative perspective. And I'm Erica Lee. I'm Professor of History and Asian American Studies at the University of Minnesota, and I'm now the director, after Donna, of the Immigration History Research Center. So we will start our discussion in order of the program, and we'll start with Donna.
Thanks, Erica. Can you hear me? This is, okay, great. So obviously I'm very excited to participate in this panel on David Fitzgerald's and David Cook Martin's book, Culling the Masses, The Democratic Origins of Racist Immigration Policy. I met the two Davids actually quite a long time ago when they were graduate students in sociology at UCLA. And since then, as Erica has said, they've both written first books, and perhaps also following the example of their PhD mentor, Roger Waldinger, have been active in actively nurturing migration studies as an interdisciplinary field where historians and sociologists meet, occasionally box a bit over their differences, and also come to understand the distinctive characteristics of their home disciplines with greater clarity, I think, as a result of the encounter. Now, I'm quite sure that David and David wanted to write a book that would be read across disciplinary lines, not just by historians, but also, I think, by political scientists who share their interests in the disturbing, if important, relationship of the democratic governance and racial and ethnic exclusions in both nationality and immigration policies. And I'm happy to report that overall they really succeeded. We're reading it, we're excited about it. While we may still box a bit this morning because of disciplinary differences, I'm equally sure we're all going to leave this room with a clearer sense of how work on a shared intellectual agenda like this one can occur not despite of our disciplinary differences, but through our diverging disciplinary practices. So the focus of my comments is really going to be on the practice and meaning of interdisciplinarity as exemplified by Culling the Masses. And I want to emphasize that it still remains devilishly difficult to do interdisciplinary scholarship on human mobility and to write about it in a way that matters sufficiently to scholars to read a work that, you know, it's a big fat book, almost 500 pages, a format that's actually much more familiar to us in history than it is perhaps in some of the social sciences at least. Now I want to be clear too that I'm going to be offering my comments, even when they become critiques, as a very sympathetic historian of international migration who actually began my own scholarly life as an undergraduate student of sociology, studying with a student of Peter Berger's, but who then made this kind of shift in the 1970s into social history and historical anthropology under the tutelage of, among other people, Chuck and Louise Tilley on the sociology side, and on the anthropology side with the close colleagues of Eric Wolf, the Mediterraneanists, Jane and Peter Schneider. So today I want to focus on what it is exactly about disciplinarity that regularly pushes historians and sociologists of migration into these kinds of dialogues, even when much of their research and writing still more often resembles a kind of preschool parallel play. We do it kind of next to each other. We admire each other's toys, but don't always really play together. So, as an historian, what most impressed me about Culling the Masses was its commitment to time and temporality as key elements of its analysis. This book is more than what sociologists usually call a longitudinal, or other disciplines it's called secular study. In fact, the temporal is one of the three analytical axes around which the authors organize their analysis. And in my comments, I want to address three dimensions of temporality that I think can focus our attentions both on the shared and the diverging agendas of our two disciplines. The first of these is chronology and periodization. The second is how we position our scholarship in our two disciplines within a temporally evolving, changing, and interdisciplinary field of study. In this case, that's the field that studies, or the scholarly study of the relationship of democracy and racial and ethnic exclusions. And my third example is the genealogy of the analytical terminologies that we work with in this field of study. So first, chronology and periodization. Chronology and periodization matter enormously in this book. We historians so often treat time as sort of like the scholarly water that we're swimming through that we sometimes fail to recognize how central the temporal framing and periodization of our analytical work is to our discipline. Lots of sociologists share with historians an interest in the past, but sociologists are not always as committed to periodization and chronology in their analytical work as our two authors here today are. Still, as an historian, just thinking really disciplinarily, I was at first, when I opened the book, I was at first struck by finding no dates whatsoever in the title and no dates whatsoever in the title of its chapters, which would be unusual in my home discipline. But I also quickly saw that chronologies of immigration and nationality policies for 22 countries, and that's presented in the book's appendix, along with the decidedly temporal nature of the tables and the graphs in its separate chapters on the US and Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and Cuba, provide exactly the kind of foundation for historical explanation that we do as historians. And they're using chronology and periodization in much the way that historians do. And that's really the foundation for their most powerful argument that the more democratic countries of the Americas introduced, especially the USA, introduced exclusionary ethnic and racial dimensions to their nationality and entry policies far earlier and relinquished them later than the more autocratic regimes in the hemisphere. But there's more than temporal framing here, one that begins with 1790 and the US's discriminatory naturalization law and ends with the elimination of discriminatory policies elsewhere. There's also periodization. There's a strong interest in the timing, literally, of first the ethnicization of such policies between, say, 1790, but especially from the 1840s and 50s through the 1930s, and then the subsequent de-ethnicization of these policies, beginning already in the 1930s and 40s in Latin America, and then continuing into the 1960s and 70s for Canada and the US and beyond for other countries. Concern with time, temporality, and periodization make Culling of the Masses one of the best examples of historically informed interdisciplinary social science that I've read in a very long time. So thank you, guys. Great. But while I rejoiced to see my colleagues in sociology thinking analytically about temporality in ways that are completely familiar to us as historians, I was more puzzled about the naming of the other two of their three analytical axes. And I'm still not completely sure I could articulate the relationship of time and the vertical and the horizontal politics. Those are the other two axes, the vertical and the horizontal. Political realms where contesting interests battle with each other. It's in the timing and the contingency of politics in these two realms, which I would instead actually just call the national and the international, but we'll get to that in a second. It's in these two political realms, vertical and horizontal, that our authors find explanations for both the ethnicization of policy, with the democracies leading the way, and the de-ethnicization that began in countries with far more authoritarian regimes, who also had troubled and/or competitive relationships to the United States. In the national or vertical realm, according to our authors, democratic politics gives voice to popular scientific racism in the US and in Canada. In the far less democratic realm of international relations, by contrast, it's the temporally evolving love-hate relationship to the United States as a colonizing, hemispheric, and ultimately global hegemon that encouraged countries in Latin America to initiate the shift toward de-ethnicized entry and nationality politics based on a critique of scientific racism as something that's often seen as emerging, hemispherically at least, from the US. So basically, although this doesn't have a whole lot to do with time, I would just love to hear you talk a bit about how you chose your names and what the relationship is, stated better than I could, of the three sort of axes of your analysis. Now to the issue of how we, or our authors, position their scholarship in an evolving and interdisciplinary scholarly field that focuses on the relationship between systems of governance and exclusionary practices in nationality and immigration. Historians tend to call this kind of an exercise historiography, or they prefer to think about the origins of contemporary scholarship as in a more genealogical sense, but both of them are temporal forms of analysis. Culling the Masses has received a great deal of praise for its focus on racially and ethnically discriminatory policies emerging first in democracies. And while I think this is a hugely important field of study, I don't really think of it as new. Sorry. And I thought this, as an historian, and here I'm thinking as an historian, I thought this relationship was pretty far well along in our understanding of it. So I just decided to dig a bit further into historiography. In other words, what's the history of the study of this topic? And as a result of that, I've actually concluded that the most important contribution of this book is not, in fact, its explication of the democratic roots of racial discrimination in the realm of national or vertical politics, but rather what I think is its very fresh new international or horizontal explanation for the origins of anti-racist thought and the de-ethnicization of policy out there in the realm of foreign relations. So, quick historiography. Scholarly concern with the relationship of democratic governance and racial discrimination goes back quite a ways, and it's been interdisciplinary almost from the get-go. It goes back at least to the 1940s in the work of Gunnar and Alva Myrdal, who first tried to understand why and how a democratic country such as the United States persisted, as it did in the 40s, in avoiding a search for the solution of what they called its dilemma of institutionalized racism. In the 1960s, both sociologists such as Pierre Vandenberg and historians such as George Fredrickson and later Kenneth Vickery developed and used the concept of Herrenvolk democracies They also sometimes use the word egalitarian racism and ethnic democracy, usually focusing their analyses on the US and South Africa, sometimes in comparison. Historian Carl Degler threw Brazil into this kind of comparative analysis of race and governance already in the 70s. By the late 1970s, other scholars were extending the analysis of Herrenvolk democracies to countries like Israel and Canada. And then in the 80s and 90s, David Roediger's analyses of whiteness also rested on the concept, and Roediger uses this phrase, Herrenvolk republicanism. Now, it's true, all of these works were more concerned with nationality policies and with discriminations against First Nations or indigenous people, or persons of African descent and of dark skin color than they were immigration. They embedded their work more in historiographies of slavery and of settler colonialism than within historiographies of immigration, as our two authors do. But Roediger's work on whiteness, and especially the work that he did together with Jim Barrett, brought the ideas of Herrenvolk republicanism quickly into immigration studies of the United States, and historians of immigration, such as Roger Daniels, Erica Lee, Adam McCune, and others, have in fact been writing about the leading role of the United States in the creation of discriminatory immigration policies for quite some time. The concept of Herrenvolk democracies actually arrives very late, as I understand it, to Spanish language scholarship, and it's arguably the case here that the contribution of this book is in using the less democratic regimes of Latin America as a kind of shadow case through which, or shadow counter case through which, or in a lens maybe, through which we can look at the better known white settler Herrenvolk democracies. And that itself is very, very valuable and a contribution of the book. Our two authors certainly do offer us an analytically powerful explanation for the relationship of democracy and discrimination. But they do so, I think, much more in dialogue with, especially with the recent work of the sociologist, I think he's a sociologist, or is he a political scientist? Jopke.
Sociologist.
Sociologist, yeah. Much more in a relationship to this recent debate coming out of political sociology. They know the work of the historians, of course, but that's not their debate partners, let's put it that way, in framing their work. And that probably explains much about the decision to use these three analytical axes of rather general labeling, at least. This tendency to trace genealogy to your own discipline is a really powerful one in history as well as in a sociologist, and it finds expression in this book in a couple of really interesting ways. I was really struck, for example, you guys, that you saw Max Weber as the inventor, or at least you traced to Max Weber the concept of elective affinity. Whew, this goes back to Goethe in the, yeah. Yeah, okay, good. So we all tend to do this, and this is where disciplinarity kind of continues to shape our work. Now, I do not mean to suggest with these critical comments that the addition of the Latin American and Caribbean countries and their analysis in relationship to the relationship of democracy and racial discriminations is trivial. Of course it isn't. But I, in particular, hope that those of us in history and in sociology who read Culling the Masses will begin to better integrate Latin American polities into our theoretical and empirical understandings, especially settler colonialism, which kind of hovers underneath these nationality politics in a way that I think could be made more explicit. Still, I continue to think that, for me at least, the really eye-opening part of this book is about the importance of the international or horizontal realm of politics, where critiques of racism diffuse from a number of sources, think Boas in New York and Freire in Brazil, and how they travel in an historical context by the 30s, 40s, and 50s of decolonization, which encouraged, I would say rightly, a kind of anti-Americanism within the Americas and possibly also worldwide as a Cold War critique of American racism, and as that racism as the source and as the symbol of Herrenvolk democracy. So it's really on the de-ethnicization part that I started to get really excited. It was the horizontal or international political realm that drove the early move toward de-ethnicization of entry and nationality policies in Latin America. Now, of course, that analysis fits kind of nicely with my own recent work on the continuous intersection of migration and international or foreign relations, and this may also explain the source of my excitement. But in any case, Culling the Masses offers a very original international and comparative analysis of how foreign relations figures in the vertical realm, where authoritarian or democratic polities forge these kinds of policies. And for me, at least, this is the most original and exciting empirical and theoretical work that's accomplished by the book. I'd like to end with just a third example, which is also about temporality in a way, by focusing on the genealogy of the words and the concepts that scholars use in their work. And I often wonder, I'm not sure I would assert this, but I wonder whether historians, because of our parallel ongoing dialogue with the humanities, whether we are more self-conscious and explicit, perhaps, about the way words function and when words become terminologies in our analyses. And in particular, I was just struck by the author's choice of the term culling for the racially selective policies that opened or closed access to national belonging and entry as foreigners into the 22 countries in the Americas that they analyze. They didn't choose sifting. They didn't choose selecting. They didn't choose choosing. All those are possibilities for a title. So I'm kind of wondering where this comes from. And, you know, when I think of myself as an historian interested in the history of ideas and concepts, you know, what Germans call Begriffsgeschichte, I headed immediately for my etymological dictionaries. I wanted to know more about this word culling, and I wanted to know the history of associations and changing meanings and resonances of that word and what using that word brings into our scholarly analysis. After all, historical migration studies, at least, and social scientist ones as well, are usually awash in what I would call, and others have called, hydrological or botanical metaphors, right? Waves and streams of people moving, right? Hydrological metaphors, or transplantation, uprooting, sort of botanical metaphors. Culling doesn't strike me as falling within any of those metaphorical fields. It comes from outside botany, outside hydrology. And of course, it can also just carry the really neutral meaning of selecting, for example, from a large number of sources. The OED, for example, gives as one definition or example of culling in this neutral sense, quote, anecdotes culled from Greek and Roman history. But in the OED and in other etymological dictionaries, culling has a second meaning. And it's a meaning which closely ties this book to the history of the state sciences, and notably to population studies and demographies, as well as, I would say, to histories of authoritarian paternalist governance and the analysis of scientific racism itself. Because a second important definition of culling is this, quote, to reduce a population of wild animals by selective slaughter, or to send an inferior or surplus animal on a farm to be slaughtered. Culling reminds us that studies of population and demography have often, in fact, rested on a metaphor not of botany or of hydrology, but of animal husbandry, in which, to use an example, an English language example from the 1600s, a monarch is a paternalist herder of his stock population. And to this day in demography, what's the word that we use for census data? Stock data. This is the realm of animal husbandry at work in our scholarly field. For those of you who know the history of scientific racism in the United States, I'm sure you know that scientific racists usually referred to nations as stock, and they distinguished the so-called old stock immigrants from the newer or more inferior rivals, who then, of course, become subject to culling, all right, through immigration restrictions. To end, I'd just simply love to hear David and David talk a bit about how they came to choose the word culling, Were they self-consciously calling attention, for example, to the use of this word in scientific racist discourse? Does it, in fact, help them to see the work of kind of more paternalist authoritarianism in the Latin American countries that they examine and analyze in this work? I don't know. I'd love to learn more. Words matter in scholarship, and by problematizing the words we choose to use, we can all, and I think David and David can help us to add a further layer of richness to an already rich analysis and to ground it in a longer and more interdisciplinary genealogy than the one that we might find if we just looked at the list of references at the end of the book. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here, very excited to be able to participate in this panel, and very excited for this significant book. I will make two comments. One is that I arrived at 3 o'clock last night, so I may not be that coherent, so I will probably read from the comments more than I usually do. And the other is on behalf of my department at University of Texas to invite you all to our reception, which takes place Saturday, 5 to 7 in the Marriott International Ballroom number 9. So we'll have food and drink, and it'd be great to see some or all of you there. So I think I am the representative of Asian American Studies, and I will say that this book has answered many of the questions circulating for at least the past decade or so that have been represented some of the most exciting research possibilities within the field. Asian American Studies scholars have been chasing the dragon of hemispheric Orientalism for at least a decade, drawn by the tantalizing observation that some form of anti-Asian and particularly anti-Chinese and Japanese immigration restrictions were enacted in most of the countries of both North and South America. Such phenomena suggested transnational transmission of ideologies regarding racial difference and the yellow peril threat posed by Asian labor, as well as exchanges of and collaborations of institutional and legal strategies that seem to point to the regional geopolitical dominance of the United States, and pressing for such barriers to be erected hemispherically. Until Culling the Masses, however, no scholars have been able to conceptualize and collect the breadth of data and historical trajectories and intersections necessary to developing substantive and persuasive analysis. Although Elliot Young is here, whose book covers 5 different countries and Chinese illegal migration, but I'd say that's sort of the most broadly sweeping book up to now. Fitzgerald and Cook Martin have produced a volume which is sweeping in its conceptual and empirical breadth, providing incredibly useful data for other scholars in tracking the institutional immigration histories of 22 American nations over more than 2 centuries, including matters such as evolving laws, administrative practices, political contexts, foreign relations, racial ideologies, demographic realities, migration flows, and the shifting parameters of international communities of nation states and their influences on matters which have often been researched primarily as matters of domestic political concern and prerogatives. So above all, this volume makes possible a great deal of comparative analysis, but obviously, in order to place each country on a basis where you can actually do this requires a lot of work and pulling together a lot of information. So for that, I think other scholars are incredibly grateful. This comprehensive and even-handed approach, although like the current state of migration research, most emphasis goes to the United States, Canada, and to Mexico, allows Fitzgerald and Cook Martin to draw the startling conclusion that liberal democracies in the hemisphere were the most prone to legislate and to retain immigration restrictions implementing barriers against targeted racial and ethnic groups. In sum, this political philosophy enshrining equality in individual rights embraced racial ideologies that asserted racial differences and the incapacities of certain races, most prominently Chinese, other Asians, blacks, Jews, and gypsies, but also some Eastern and Northern Europeans, to participate in democratic political systems as fully independent individuals exercising free will. So this goes to your understanding of individual capacities. Scientific racism supported this view that certain races simply could not participate, could not exercise free will. Although troubling to many political theorists, this contradiction is inherent in the scholarship of critical race studies theorists. Most recently, Lisa Lowe's The Intimacies of Four Continents ambitiously scrutinizes the relationships of trade, labor markets, mobility of workers and individuals, material goods, ideas, and cultural capital that situated the Caribbean as a crucible for imperial relationships and processes in which the unfitness of Asians, blacks, and indigenous peoples for individual rights was presumed by some of the foremost thinkers of liberalism, such as John Stuart Mill. Fitzgerald and Cook Martin acknowledge this troubling history, but argue that while liberal democracies have harbored and advanced racist immigration controls, such discriminations are not essential components of democratic nations. And so here they try to point towards a more hopeful set of future possibilities through what they call the horizontal dimensions of immigration debates. And like Donna, I agree that this is probably the most important contribution of this study, in which the immigration regimes of individual nations are subject to scrutiny, criticism, and influence by international communities of other nations. Even powerful liberal democracies such as the United States and Canada have removed overt forms of discrimination from their immigration laws and replaced them with more neutral versions. And this book is also very helpful in terms of mapping out the kinds of infrastructures and forms of conversation and meetings and gatherings through which this kind of influence is disseminated. One of the most significant contributions of Culling the Masses is Fitzgerald and Cook Martin's conclusion that this mid-20th century retreat from overt immigration restriction by predominantly white, wealthy, and powerful liberal democracies, so countries that emerged out of white settler colonialism in the Americas, was the product not of the ideals of liberalism, but through pressure from weaker Latin American states, but also countries like China and Japan, acting through international organizations and coalitional groups to press anti-racist standards on countries throughout the world. Foreign relation considerations, whether for status and prestige or for trade relationships, compelled the United States and Canada to disguise the racial preferences in their immigration legislation. Even the 1965 Immigration Act, which in hindsight has become celebrated as civil rights legislation and the opening of U.S. doors to multiracial equality of admissions, was legislated with promises from its liberal backers that it would not change the racial makeup of the country. For example, Representative Emanuel Seller, so his name is on the law, a sponsor of the bill, told his colleagues, quote, "With the end of discrimination due to place of birth, there will be shifts in countries other than those of Northern and Western Europe. Immigrants from Asia and Africa will have to compete and qualify in order to get in, quantitatively and qualitatively, which itself will hold the numbers down. There will not be, comparatively, many Asians or Africans entering this country. Since the people of Africa and Asia have very few relatives here, comparatively few could immigrate from those countries because they have no family ties in the United States." And so if you look at the 1965 law, the emphasis is on family reunification. And this is a way of masking the effort to keep down forms of immigration from immigrants from Africa and Asia. A significant corollary to Fitzgerald and Cook Martin's conceptualization of the horizontal dimensions of immigration debates is the importance of nation-state status for participation in international systems of enacting immigration restrictions that express changing visions of national interests, but also enable participation in international and influential communities of nation-states. That is, they track the emergence of nation-states out of colonial status, which then puts you in a position not only to enact your own national preferences in terms of imposing immigration restrictions, but then also allows you to advocate on behalf of your people who would be migrating elsewhere, but then also to assert opinions on an international stage regarding what you think international standards should be regarding, for example, immigration controls. Fitzgerald, treatment of migrants mattered only if they could be represented by a reasonably respected sovereign nation. Fitzgerald and Cook Martin very aptly quote Hannah Arendt in 1951, who said, "Sovereignty is nowhere more absolute than in matters of emigration, naturalization, nationality, and expulsion. To direct attention to the degree of power nation states can claim over border matters." And this has become, I think, internationally accepted. Each nation state as it emerged, and in the Americas was to shed imperial controls, had considerable stakes in advancing its future interests through the mechanism that most openly allowed each to define and control the kind of population understood as best advantaging national interests. So immigration restrictions are perhaps the most explicit aspect of government powers that allows you to try to shape the demographic attributes of your population. In Fitzgerald and Cook-Martin's account, this pertained not only to trying to shape domestic populations, but also of keeping track of the insults and side consequences that could result from the immigration restriction regimes of other and particularly neighboring nations. And so you were attentive not only to trying to manage your own population, but how this happened in relation to other countries. As nation states, they not only began legislating and implementing their own versions of immigration control, but were positioned to participate in pressing for particular global standards of racial equality and rights of mobility. And so one of the things that comes through clearly is that there are different kinds of ways in which you can try to insert racial and ethnic preferences into your immigration restrictions. And the most offensive and most likely to raise objections is to openly just ban certain kinds of people from entering. But there are other less offensive ways of doing this. You can try to recruit certain kinds of people, which is what we see in the current state of U.S. laws. You can use coded language, such as assimilability, literacy tests. You can also have things buried not in laws, but in executive orders, administrative procedures that also allow you to accomplish these same ends. And so an aspect now of immigration controls is actually the need to divert attention from certain kinds of agendas that a certain nation state may be attempting to accomplish. I want to end this comment with a set of open-ended questions regarding the problematic history of some of the world's wealthiest liberal democratic nations, which trace back several centuries of actively upholding racial hierarchies that conferred significant political and economic advantages on those considered to merit the full rights of individuals, which include not only the right to vote, but also mobility and control over their own labor. The intersections of the demarcations that excluded Asians and blacks from such rights as forms of unfree labor, so Asians as indentured contract workers and blacks as slaves, had received a certain amount of attention by scholars such as Lisa Lowe, Lisa Yoon, Moon Ho Jung, and Kathy Lopez, but we have yet to think through the implication of lesser rights consigned to certain races in the form of limited rights to mobility. That is, another key right of individuals should be the right to free movement, a key right denied to the enslaved in the United States. And so what I also wanted to consider, the relationship of the lack of freedom of mobility of slaves also to efforts to control movements across borders, which then, at least in the contemporary United States, then produces people with unequal status because they don't have legal rights of entry, of residency, or of employment. For this discussion, I am indebted to Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who directed me to Frederick Douglass's 1869 speech, Our Composite Nationality, which he delivered to a group of Boston abolitionists commenting on an 1862 law that had been passed by Congress to ban the importation of Chinese coolies, as discussed most prominently by Moon Ho Jung and Coolies and Kane. The Republican-dominated Congress was responding to discussions by Southern plantation owners that Chinese contract workers might constitute an ideal pool of replacement laborers in case of the end of slavery in the American South. Chinese were seen as hardworking, docile, unlikely to be mixing with other groups, and likely to remain in place, unlike their fears about what would happen if their slaves gained their freedom. These plans did not work out for a variety of reasons, but the law did go on the books. So Douglas observes this, and and very much having in mind the recent emancipation of African American slaves, but also many of the conditions attending to slavery. One of the most onerous ones of which was the lack of freedom to move around. Leads Douglas to make the following sets of observations. I submit that this question of Chinese immigration should be settled upon higher principles than those of a cold and selfish expediency. There are such things in the world as human rights. They rest upon no conventional foundation, but are eternal, universal, and indestructible. Among these is the right of locomotion, the right of migration, the right which belongs to no particular race, but belongs alike to all, and to all alike. It is the right you assert by staying here, and your fathers asserted by coming here. It is this great right that I assert for the Chinese and the Japanese, and for all other varieties of men, equally with yourselves, now and forever. I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity, and when there is a supposed conflict between human and national rights, it is safe to go the side of humanity. So he makes this plea and this pitch, which we haven't paid attention to, because I think what has happened is that differential immigration status and access actually is one of the main ways in which we continue to allow persistent inequalities to be enacted in American society. Chinese and black slaves could be stripped of their rights of mobility precisely because they were understood to be racially incompetent of wielding the full capacities of white American citizens because they were on free forms of labor. Fitzgerald and Cook-Martin draw attention to an early, barely acknowledged immigration restriction dating from 1803, I learned something, in which the federal government banned the entry of blacks. In hindsight, this entirely makes sense from the perspective of understanding that through the 1960s and 1970s in some liberal democracies, race remained an acceptable determinant of inassimilability and unsuitability for citizenship, and therefore restriction of immigration rights. Of course, even free blacks could not enter the United States because they, like their enslaved counterparts, as a race were considered unsuitable for citizenship. Despite Douglas's warning in 1869, clearly in the United States we have not paid enough attention, although conditions have improved greatly since 1965, and notwithstanding the intentions of Congress. Race and ethnicity have become unacceptable criterion for determining eligibility for legal immigration, although various more covert measures and conditions continue to seek such outcomes. However, here I wish to hearken back to Arendt and set her observation alongside that of Douglas's upholding of mobility as a human right, which should be available to all. However, at the juncture between national interests expressed through regimes of border controls and that of would-be migrants seeking entry, residence, and often employment from a nation that is not their own, nation-states can securely claim the authority and right to assert their own border preferences against unwanted or unauthorized immigrants, as long as the attending criteria are not discriminatory in unacceptable ways. And so because you can position this, and this is something that we see very much in the news in current political campaigns, you assert the security and the interests of the nation against these people who are trying to enter without your authorization, without having been exposed to these culling processes, and that stripping away of rights is to varying degrees considered acceptable. Thus, the 1965 Immigration Act, with its capping of migrations within the American Hemisphere and the subsequent crises of 12 million long-term unauthorized residents, as well as the proliferation of detention centers and asylum seekers at the U.S.'s southern border, produces conditions in which certain people do not have equal rights of entry. The federal government has this kind of sovereign authority over border controls as upheld repeatedly by the judicial branch. Although it has responded to international and some domestic pressures to retreat from overtly racist and ethnic discriminations in immigration laws and policies, nonetheless it is able to argue national interests outweigh those of would-be immigrants to the United States. Thus, the note I wish to end on is a call to explore further two matters. One, further linkages between Chinese and African American racialization and diminished rights to mobility in the United States, including the mechanisms and legislative strategies for enacting such differential statuses, and 2, immigration status as a form of inequality that has emerged and remains sanctioned because it pits national interests against those of individuals with limited claims on nations refusing entry or residency. Thank you.
Get this. So thanks for the invitation. It's actually a pleasure to be here. I actually evaluated this manuscript for Harvard University Press about 5 years ago, I think, actually, the manuscript. Takes a long time to turn it into a book. And I obviously supported it strongly. While doing this, I checked, I tried to learn more about the literature on immigration controls. And I check, your standard library catalog at Columbia University, and the phrase immigration policy, I found 3,279 books. So despite the claims by many scholars that the immigration policy is understudied, this is far the case. Neither are comparative studies rare. Just to use poor Canada as an example, I found books about comparing Canadian immigration policy to US immigration policy, Canadian immigration policy to Australian, Canadian immigration policy to Australian and United States, to France, to Australia, Brazil, and Japan, So, and this is only an example. So why did I support this book for publication so strongly? And I even had some nice words to say on a blurb on the cover. Well, for several reasons. I guess let me count the ways. It is the only study that covers the entire Western Hemisphere. And this is very important, actually, because there is something particular about the Western Hemisphere, which is the notion of citizenship of the Western Hemisphere. There is 38 countries in the Western Hemisphere, all but 2 grant citizenship as a birthright to the native-born children of immigrants. That is very rare in the rest of the world. There's 156 countries outside of the Western Hemisphere. Only 7 grant citizenship as a birthright to the children of immigrants. So this is something important. It is also very telling that there is a country now that is not granting birthright citizenship, the Dominican Republic. And it supports your major argument here, because it is today when the Dominican Republic is the most democratic and liberal that it has ever been, that it decides to take away, actually, citizenship from the Haitian immigrants and their children. The other one is that the managerial historical perspective, where Donna referred to this. Such perspective is not unusual in single countries studies, but it is rare in multi-country studies, and it is non-existent in continental size studies like yours. So in that sense, it is one of a kind, in spite of the existence of, I'm sure by now, 4,000 books on the topic, because in the interim, in the last quinquennium, I'm sure that 20 or 40 have appeared. To call this a cottage industry is an understatement. This is not a cottage industry. This is industry at the level of Manchester, the Ruhr Valley, Pittsburgh. The other thing is that the fact that this is a monograph instead of an edited volume, and this allows the authors to control the structure and content of the material, resulting in a level of analytical integration and lucidity absent in even the best of compilations of edited volumes. That would be impossible. The combination of hemispheric perspective, expansive historical span, and analytical integration sets apart this manuscript from the rest of the voluminous scholarly literature on the ethno-racial components of immigration policy. But this also adds a quality to this. You also have to add the quality of the empirical research and the imaginative methodology. It is very creative. This includes qualitative sources and methods, quantitative history, sociology, deep research, archival research in 5 countries, an impressive database of immigration laws in 22 countries, and so on and so forth. This methodological combination in turn makes possible a disciplinary theoretical symbiosis that integrates sociology and history. It is actually admirable. I'm sure that historians can find a lot of things to complain about, but that's the name of the game when you try to integrate things that are not usually totally integrated. That is a challenge, right? And also the analytical and narrative modes of writing, structuralism and post-structuralism critique and critical race theory, a methodical search for patterns, and at the same time attention to nuance, contingency, and local specificity. That's a big task. Another form of dialectical approach fuses categories of analysis, and I think this is one of the really interesting things of the book. Domestic and geopolitics components, the vertical and the horizontal, class interests and racial attitudes that can cut across class divisions and economic interest, and institutional network analysis, because it's both institutional but also the networks of institutions, a social history of these institutions in a sense, right? The questions that I have, or some are reservations, some are simply query, relate not so much to the book, but maybe to the entire genre of immigration policy studies. One is what I call the conundrum of legal determinism, right? The idea, what is the relationship between the laws and social and political reality? What is the relationship between immigration legislation and in actual immigration mobility? You cannot take that for granted, right? There is a sentence in the book, an assertion that through immigration policy, governments, quote, define the community that makes them nation state. If this were true, most Latin American countries would look like Teutonic republics. Because during the 19th century, it was a hobby, a ruling class hobby, to try to bring Germans to Latin America. And, well, they didn't come. And where they went is actually where they were searched the least, southern Brazil and Argentina and temperate South America. The question is, had the US not passed a single law on immigration before 1921, would its ethnic composition look particularly different? Yes, there may have been 10 more million descendants of the Chinese, although even that is questionable for a very single reason. 96% of the Chinese that came to the United States before any restriction law were male, like were 96 or 99% of the ones who went to Cuba, Peru, Cambodia, Thailand, you know. So this is nothing about US legislation, right? It is very difficult to become a very large ethnic community if 99% or 96% of the immigrants are male, unless they discover an asexual mode of reproduction, obviously. The predominance of Northwestern Europeans in before the 1890s, and then the shift to Southern and Eastern European migration, does that have anything to do with legislation? I doubt it. I doubt it. Because you see it everywhere. And countries that had no legislation, and this is particularly true of the 19th century. The 20th century, the connection between legislation and actual migration is actually stronger. That is the case, right? The other thing is that the most dramatic and successful ethnic engineering in terms of migration appeared not by liberal states, appeared actually in the 1930s and 40s, where global international migration is at a low, right? and appears in Manchuria, Central Asia, Japan, right? By countries that are Stalinist Russia, China, Kuomintang China, that are the epitome of illiberal states. So here, the ones that actually are most successful are controlling population movement and selecting and culling. I wonder if culling is the idea of, it sounds like calling to me, so the irony, right? Calling the immigrants and calling the immigrants. I don't know. I'm talking about these hydrological metaphors. I use them a lot, but words do matter. But why they matter? Maybe not what we think. Why do I use them a lot? Because after using migration 20 times in a paragraph, flow and streams, I will hang on to any other term other than migrations, just out of an aesthetic, component, right? You get tired of seeing the same word in the. I think that's why we mostly use them. We don't have hydrology in mind when we're using this type of terminology. The other thing is that the argument that the U.S. passes restrictive ethnic migration laws way before other countries in the hemisphere. Well, the United States exists as a nation state way before. 50 years before, formally, and 100 years before de facto. I mean, there are very few functioning nation states in Latin America before the 1860s, 70s, right? So that by itself, doesn't say anything, doesn't mean much. Another challenge with all of these type of studies is that passing laws may mean very different things. How difficult was it for Central American countries to pass laws prohibiting Chinese immigration in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when there was no Chinese? I found the example of, I think it was Nicaragua, that passed a law prohibiting the entry of Chinese into Nicaragua. You know how many Chinese there were in Nicaragua? 5. So these are passing laws to prohibit the people from entering that are not coming. That I don't know what it means. At one point you say something like performative or dramatic. I love that term. And by the same token, how meaningful it is for countries in Latin America, even the authoritarian countries, to do away with ethnic and any type of restriction on immigration, when in the 1930s and 40s almost no one was coming. It is very interesting that, how meaningful it was for Trujillo to say that he was going to welcome 100,000 Jews when 20 came. Well, not 20, no, actually more. In Susua, it's about 1,000. And comparing that to the 1924 law, right, in the United States. So in some cases, passing an immigration law is just immaterial, really. It tells us more about what they want to portray. Is, I don't know, like Ecuador saying that they will welcome all of these refugees from Syria and Afghanistan, or Germany saying that they welcome them. They're not going to Ecuador. So it's an empty gesture, really. Nice gesture, but easy. It's not that there is a popular opposition to that, right? Related to this is what you could call the liberal conundrum. That is, immigrants tend to prefer going to liberal states than to illiberal states. So in this case, for all of these authoritarian states, immigration law, it's not about immigration. It's not about actual people coming and entering. It's about showing that they're morally superior to the United States, showing that they're more modern, showing there is an element of mimicry. If you look at national legislation, nationalism or nation states are the least creative entities in the history of humanity, probably. If you look at any nation state on paper, they all look exactly alike. It doesn't matter if there's Zimbabwe or Switzerland. On paper, they look exactly alike. So they have passports, they have money, they have legislation, they have constitutions, check flags, national songs, national birds. And one of the things is controlling entry into your borders. So how much of this is just that it comes along with being a nation, right? Just as having constitutions and flags, right? And that there is an element of mimicry and imitation and you know, rather than anything meaningful, right? The other interesting thing here, and I think this is one of the most insightful elements of the book, is that although we call them liberal democracies, this is a very strange marriage, right? And actually contradictory. On the one hand, liberal means individual rights, and on the other hand, democracy means the rule of the majority, the will of the majority. And usually the will of the majority is actually not to let people in, not to give minority rights, right? It is very interesting that since we have polling data, the difference between elites of any kind, cultural, political, economic elites in the United States and just about everywhere, in terms of their attitudes toward immigration, which is very welcoming. It's not pro-immigrant, but it's definitely pro-immigration. And that of the less educated and people with lower levels of income is huge. And the gap in that is actually stronger than in any other issue. That is the gap between the desires of the elites and the desires of the masses in terms of immigration or xenophobia is actually wider than what are the other hot issues? Gun control or abortion, gay marriage. So this is actually something deep. The other observation that I wanted to make is that although legislation may be more restrictive, right, in liberal democracies, xenophobic violence is also much lower. It is very telling that the worst instances of xenophobic anti-immigrant violence in the Western Hemisphere did not happen in the United States, Canada, or even Argentina, Uruguay, or Brazil, where actually immigrants were coming in the thousands, in the millions. It happened, the worst one is actually in the Dominican Republic, the massacre of 15,000 Haitians by the Trujillo regime, the same Trujillo regime that wanted to bring in 100,000 Jews, right? And that welcomed actually Spanish Republican exiles. After that, a massacre of Chinese in northern Mexico. After that, a massacre of Chinese in Peru, right? So and not to mention xenophobic violence in Asia, where massacres of Chinese or other groups, right? In Vietnam, I mean, 70% of the boat people in Vietnam were ethnic Chinese, a group that makes, I don't know, 7-8% of the population used to make, not anymore, right? The victims of the Pol Pot regime, huge proportion are Chinese. Indonesia, right? So in that sense, that is interesting that although there is greater restriction of entry, there is lower levels of xenophobic violence. Maybe simply because more stronger states or stronger rule of law. And then the other thing in terms of the horizontal, the Cold War politics and diplomacy and stuff like that, the conundrum here is that Latin Americans were the only group, actually, that were not restricted from entry into the United States. Right? The 1924 restrictions that officially, legally restricted European immigration too, not only Asian immigration, although de facto it was try to restrict Southern and Eastern European immigration, did not apply to Latin Americans. I don't know when the first restrictions on Latin American immigration to the United States happened.
They're informal, they're 30s, they're economic, they're at the ground level.
Yeah, but not officially, right? So at the ground level, for diplomacy is not that important, actually. And it's not that people are coming from South America to the United States. It's basically Mexico only, right? So how important were restrictions against Chinese and Asian immigrations in the United States for Latin American governments? That's, a question that I had. But like I said, this is a great book. It has passed the test of excellence by winning all of these prizes. I says the prizes are the true test of excellence, right? Because you can always say that this book is among the best that you have ever read, but you can say that about many books, about all books. But you can only give the prize to one. So that's actually a way of a test of honesty, of keeping us honest, that doesn't work with letters of recommendation where everyone is in the top 1%. Okay, so thanks for. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
So I think I'm going to propose that we have between 8 and 10 minutes of response so that we have enough time for the audience questions, if that sounds okay? Okay.
Yeah, so thanks very much for the comments. Let me start with the title. And we chose that title very deliberately in reference to the things that you were talking about. And it's impossible to talk about immigration and masses without invoking the famous quotation at the base of the Statue of Liberty. And we wanted to highlight that behind that history of a nation of immigrants is a very ugly, harsh process of selection. We also liked the idea of culling as a title because it can refer both to the negative selection as well as the positive preferences, and because it did have that resonance with scientific racism, which was often based on metaphors about animal husbandry. So that was a very deliberate choice on our part. Regarding these different levels of analysis, the vertical, the horizontal, the temporal, let me start with why do we talk about the horizontal dimension rather than simply the international? It's actually a substantive issue because we wanted to show not only how the relationships among nation states influence policies, but also how transnational, strictly speaking, beyond the national, epistemic communities of networks of scientific experts, demographers, eugenicists, anti-racist activists, and so forth, influence those policies. And in the book, we actually trace the role not only of those networks, but of specific individuals who had influences on policies in different countries, as well as, in a chapter primarily authored by David, the international organizations and transnational organizations, two different kinds of organizations that were vehicles for that diffusion of policy. And it's really, when we get to the discussion of diffusion, how is it that policies developed here, influence policies there, that you see the intersection between the temporal dimension and these vertical and horizontal dimensions. Because if we had started this book out from a more, poli-sci quantitative sort of perspective, we would have done a correlational analysis of level of liberalism and degree of racial restrictiveness in the laws over time. But that would have ignored the importance of sequence and the fact that you had, this is preaching to the choir in this audience here, but the fact that you had existing models which were then adopted by countries that were not created ex nihilo is very important in understanding how these policies developed in any given country and in any given time. In terms of, is there anything new in this notion that the democracies were the first ones to develop these racist policies? Donna suggested, and others have suggested, well, we already knew that. But then Madeline comes along and says, this is a startling conclusion.
Yeah, no, I was really struck by our different reactions to that.
So, and it's absolutely true that we are primarily in dialogue with a set of social scientists, Kristen Yopke, Gary Freeman, who made this argument. But there are also prominent historians, such as John Hyam, the most prominent historian of American nativism, who would have a lot of new grist for his mill these days, making very explicitly this argument that there's something fundamentally incompatible about liberal democracy on the one hand and racism on the other. So I do think that there are historians who have made that argument, But absolutely, I agree with you that people who have studied these issues, and certainly in other aspects of the law, or more strictly looking at Anglophone settler societies, are aware of that. We actually take comfort from the fact that other scholars looking at a set of similar issues have reached this, this conclusion. There's a lot more to say. I know David has some things. Well, let me turn it over to David, and then I will pick up the pieces that are left over.
Well, one point, following up on the choice of vertical, why vertical, not national.
Or
So David,
domestic, I mean, other people use other words for it. That's really only mine.
sure, and so David has talked a little bit about why the horizontal rather than merely international. Well, by using the vertical, we also wanted to capture different levels of aggregation or different levels of political dynamics. So what's going on the local, provincial, the municipal, provincial, and so on level, and use that across the cases, at least the qualitative cases that we were looking at, because it makes a huge difference whether you're looking at California and parts of California versus the nation. And we wanted to be able to trace some of the development of ideas about how to call people, up and down, right, the scale. So that was, maybe they were, I'm sure there are less clumsy terms, and maybe for the next one we.
Well, I just wondered if it was a reach for a higher level of generalization, because time temporality is
Well, sure.
pretty damn general too. Anyway, thank you. That's really helpful to me.
Let me then switch over to some of Jose's points about immigration policy, and basically the effect of immigration policies. And you're right, we do think of immigration policies as performative, and so our focus is not on immigration policy as an independent variable, but we actually want to see how it was constituted, and we infer something about state making and nation state making, and I think we would agree with most of what you said about the lack of imagination that state and builders of nations have demonstrated, right? But we wanted to see how that actually happened with respect to immigration and across a variety of cases that go beyond the typical settler state comparisons that we've had.
Yeah, just one quick comment. I would like to, take up your question, which was not a question we thought about in the book, but it's a very interesting question about what are the long-term impacts of having certain racialized groups who have been excluded previously in history. How does that matter today? And I think that the idea of cultural citizenship is useful here. Had there not been these kinds of restrictions over the last 150, 200 years, I think that, for example, people with Asian faces today in the Americas would not regularly be asked, where are you from? When the response is not satisfactory if it's Philly. People want to know where you're really from, where is your family from, not where were you actually born. And so I think that's an artifact of the accretion of these kinds of restrictive policies that then have very, very long legs, many decades out. And I know we're having a conference at UT Austin where we'll more fully discuss this issue, but when we think about the 1965 Act, there is also a lot of evidence that many of the people in Congress and in the executive who pushed that act through did understand that that would dramatically change U.S. immigration patterns, but no one predicted that it would be as dramatic as it was. So there's some interesting historiographic disputes about that I'm sure we'll be getting into.
Okay. Great. Are there questions from the audience? And if you would just introduce yourself before you ask your question, that would be helpful.
Elliot Young. So I love the book, but I was a little surprised by the end of it. I found it to be sort of a little optimistic about the direction that the country might head in. And I think it ends with this idea of the de-ethnicization of immigration policies starting in 1965. And I think in the book you acknowledge the fact that in terms of enforcement and on-the-ground practice of the way immigration policies work, it's not at all de-ethnicized. And I was reading this, of course, in the last few months in the context of Donald Trump, and thinking, that this idea that it's unthinkable that people would come up with ethnically based immigration policies, which is your assertion, it's just not true. It's thinkable within a very dominant political candidate today. So I'm wondering whether, in light of what's happened in the last year, you are rethinking your optimism.
So this is an excellent question. I just want to clarify, we don't say that it's unthinkable that there would be ethnic restrictions. The end of the book concludes with answering the question, could there be a reemergence of explicit ethnic restrictions? We think that historically there is no question after reading these pages that there has been a dominant trend from a thoroughly racialized policy, thoroughly ethnicized policy, to one that is much, much less than it has been historically. That's a different question, though, about is there any impact of ethnicity or race in discussions at all. That's a different reference point, and we are interested in both of those reference points. And so, in the light of things that have happened since we wrote the book, let's talk specifically about the proposals from people like Donald Trump to ban Muslim immigration. Then we've gone back and thought about, well, how does that relate to the conclusions we had in the book? And sadly, I think that that's entirely in keeping with the conclusions in the book, in the very last pages of the book. The proposals that have been made by governments have come from two different kinds of places. One is from local governments in places like French towns that are controlled by the right-wing National Front Party. And those policies have been disowned by the national government, entirely in keeping with our argument that it's at the local level that we'll see much more aggressive policies that either explicitly or implicitly target specific ethnic groups because the mayor of a town or Joe Arpaio don't care about the international ramifications. The countries whose governments have made these proposals, specifically Slovakia and Hungary, to ban Muslim refugees, are countries that don't have a very great international weight. They also don't care very much what other governments in far-flung corners of the world think about their policies in the way that the French and the British and the Germans and the Americans and the Canadians do. In the U.S., we were surprised. I think most people were surprised that this became such an open proposal, but these are also proposals. These are not government policies. I suspect that were Donald Trump to become elected, God forbid, it would be very hard to translate that into a law. So it's important to look at, and we're keenly interested in it. I still think that it's highly unlikely to happen. You can ask me again next year, and we'll see.
How wrong
I hope
I
I'm right.
Yeah. So, but following up on the logic of that question, I mean, really the Dominican case could also be seen as an argument against what we say about the conditions under which we would expect.
Oh, not really, actually, because of international public opinion, they were forced to go back a bit.
Up.
Yeah.
But in the end,
yeah.
they've actually started implementing some elements of this,
restricting
right?
entry, but not taking away citizenship from the children of previous immigrants.
And they don't specify Haitians. Everybody in the world knows that this is just about Haitians, but it's not in the law, and it's not in the law for a reason, and it would have been in the law, 50 years ago.
The point is that, as you predicted, international opinion did have an
matter.
effect.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that another dimension of this is that the Dominicans perceive this to be an existential, the inflow, using the hydrological metaphors here, the inflow of Haitians is viewed or some folks perceive it to be an existential threat to what they have achieved, ironically at a time when they're doing particularly well economically, right? So my point though is that we specify some conditions under which we expect that we might see. So there are, I think that there's, we hedge a little bit with the conditions under which explicit exclusions might come to light in law, right? Competing here with them.
I'm Beth Williams. I was playing in my mind, Madeline, with your call to connect this to internal mobility. And I'm not sure that the U.S. example works perfectly, since I think that the controlling mobility of slaves and then freedmen is so much about containing them in their workforce, and whereas exclusion is so much about, you know, keeping them out. And so I'm still playing within my mind. But I do think that it brings up a larger danger, perhaps, that if we assume that the way that we need to compare and connect laws, we assume that the laws have to be about immigration, and that that's sort of the genealogy, instead of in some areas how other forms of more domestically based.
Mobility is the word.
Yes,
I think.
mobility,
Yeah.
within nations. So I was just curious to hear you talk more about sort of, or not necessarily even mobility, you know, if the super category are things about subjugation, racial restrictions. You know, I think there are other genealogies we could build other than immigration as sort of the super category that connects these things. And I was just wondering.
So for this came out of a conversation with a colleague who works in African American history, and I was talking about the 1892 requirement that Chinese who had legally entered carry certificates of residence, which then documented their right to be in the United States, and that if you didn't have your certificate, you could then be deported, right? So simply to be present, to have immigrated into the United States, you had to have documentation, which is parallel in some ways to the documents that the enslaved or free blacks had to carry around to show that they in fact had the right to be on the road. And so the question that came up, which would have to be investigated, is was there in some way a replication of the technology of how you try to control that population, right? You know, and so that's the specific instance that I was thinking about. But I think your book is really incredibly useful in showing multiple instances in which certain kinds of practices or strategies get replicated in different kinds of contexts. And I think it's very helpful to be able to work through that systematically, which is why I described as startling this conclusion that liberal democracies have in fact been so key in harboring racial discriminations. It's, I made that comment because it's something that has long been asserted by critical race theorists, but it's actually when you have the comparative analysis that you can say, well, it's really true. And so this is, I think, another one of the great strengths of this study, that it allows us to say certain things much, much more conclusively and persuasively.
I also took your point to be about what happens once people are inside the country, and our analysis of laws, in the quantitative analysis of laws, focuses on immigration policy sort of at the threshold, right? So that's an important distinction to make. We're not doing the same kind of analysis with everything that happens once people are inside. However, in the case studies, we do look at what happens in terms of the use of, although criterion of assimilability were also used at the threshold, how those were used internally, and that actually prompts debate or puts our work in conversation with current work on integration in Europe, right? And so we have a sideline where we talk a little bit about that in an article, but that's what I took your point to be, right? What happens once inside? And the answer is, our analysis is focused primarily on laws at the threshold. In the case studies, we talk about these, I think, more or less systematically, but not in, we don't have that 22 country comparison.
I want to thank the panel. I also want to tie together a few of the questions and comments in a way to not only think about the merits of the book, but also think about how we can connect this history to what's going on today, which is what I think Elliot is asking about and which, David, you just touched upon. And that is in a post-civil rights era in which race-neutral immigration laws is the status quo on paper, how might a study of what you've just accomplished look like in a more recent era? And might we, would we be remiss in only looking at the policies at the threshold then, when so much of the ongoing discrimination in immigration has happened to those who have already made it within the country? But also how have we become so well equipped to discriminate at the port of entry without using those language? What other mechanisms are we using that has allowed for the unthinkable to be almost mainstream then? What has happened in the past 50 years that has allowed us to come to this point, not only in the United States, but around the world through the formal legal structure, but also in terms of informal policies of immigration? So you've given us a lot to think about with this wonderful volume. Thank you, the panelists. This, I think, is a dream team of historians if you were to pick. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, audience, for coming, and enjoy the rest of the day today.